Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. We are super excited to have Ashton Anderson as our speaker today. He's an assistant professor in the computer science department here, and he's also a faculty affiliate of ours as well. And as I was just saying to him as we were in the green room before we let you all in, I've been really, Ashton and I have not yet had a sustained conversation. I'm so excited to finally connect in this way and hear about this work. He's also a faculty affiliate at the Vector Institute. His research is in computational social science, encompassing a diverse range of questions at the intersection of AI, data, and society. And of course, has been in very many prestigious venues, including the PNAS, Sociological Science International Conference on Machine Learning. And he is talking to us today about polarization in online media, and we'll get started. And Ashton is happy to take questions as we go along if you have them. So I will monitor the chat, and you can also use the hand raise function. I'll look for that too. Okay, take it away, Ashton.
Great. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
We got it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that kind intro. Let me just get my phone out so I can see what time it is. Okay. Yeah, so I'm very excited to finally be talking to this group. Yeah, like Jillian said, I run the CSS lab, computational social science lab in the CS department here. And we work on essentially the same intersection of things that SRI does. So been very excited to hear all the exciting work that's been going on, and excited to connect with you all even more. So today I'm going to be talking about joint work done with my PhD student, Isaac Waller. And the subject today is the large-scale kind of structure of discussion and social connectivity on the internet. So kind of going way back to the early days of the internet, there was a lot of kind of techno-optimism about the internet's potential to connect us. So it dramatically lowered the kind of barriers to entry to connecting with people you may have otherwise just not have had a way to connect with before. And the early days of the internet were super fun. It was you could just go on like online chat rooms and enjoy the kind of like novelty of talking with strangers on the internet. I think today is a little bit different, but there was a lot of excitement just around connection. And of course, recently, there's been a bit more skepticism that the internet not only has the power to connect us, but has the power to divide us as well. And that can happen simultaneously where, in the language of social capital, it's possible and plausible that the internet can increase bonding social capitals, can strengthen the connections within groups, but at the expense of weakening kind of bridging social capital. So weakening the ties between groups. So that's the kind of large scale question that we have, is when you look at discussion at a kind of the macro scale on the internet, is the internet kind of splintered into these different groups along important social and cultural lines? So there's a rich set of literatures that this is relating to. The earliest example that I could find when people were talking about this was back in the 90s when it was called cyber balkanization. And so the question there was, are electronic communities more like global villages where everyone can talk to everyone else, or are they balkanized into these small groups? This more kind of echo chamber like point is related to but distinct from filter bubbles. So we probably have heard about those. And that is different in the sense that it's really more a question about does information and news and our social ties, are all of these things online mediated by the algorithms that drive, for example, feeds. So that is a very powerful force. But today we're going to be talking more about the kind of aggregate structure that's imposed by individual choice. And so this is related to just homophily as an organizing principle for networks, both offline and online. So homophily is just the tendency for like to associate with like. So as the internet can enable mass selection into like-minded groups, homophily structures friendships and work, and in the transfer of important news, both offline and online. And like I mentioned, the particular question that we're going to be studying today is there selection, into homogeneous groups along cultural lines? So one particularly important example of that is there political polarization online, and what is the role of social media in it? There's been, quite a debate around this, and there's been a lot of interesting evidence on both sides. One early study found that internet use itself does not seem to be a cause, at least at the country level. So the kind of aggregate internet use of countries is not related to their political polarization scores at all. But more recently, there's been kind of more specific individual level evidence that deactivating Facebook can reduce the polarization of the people that use it. And throughout all this, the mechanism that people are concerned about is what's been called the law of group polarization. So this is a really general phenomenon. Whenever it turns out when you put people in groups and they deliberate, they tend to polarize. So whenever kind of people are like-minded people discuss, they tend to move closer to the extreme that they started off tending towards. So we want to measure the online structure, the cultural makeup of online communities. So the way I think about it actually is, imagine the internet is like a big party and people are kind of discussing in groups. And what we're really concerned with is what is the makeup of those groups? Are they pretty well mixed around in the different circles, or are people kind of congregating in these circles that are kind of very, very homogeneous along certain important lines? And furthermore, if you went to that party several times over the course of the night and people are kind of shifting between the circles, are they getting even more homogeneous than they were before? So to do this, though, is difficult. And the reason is that online discussion and interaction is, first of all, very large scale. So we're talking about billions of people. It's unstructured. So it's even hard to first figure out how you would computationally analyze it. And then importantly, a lot of discussion is anonymous, or people are using pseudonyms. So to attribute, kind of social or cultural indicators to these people is hard. So in this work, we make two major contributions to try and answer these questions. The first is we introduce a kind of general purpose methodology that uses embeddings to quantify communities along interpretable social and behavioral axes. So given a kind of general online community of people, we'll be able to associate a score of where those communities lie on certain spectra, for example, from younger to older, and we validate those scores against external metrics. And so we believe this method works quite well. And I think this method can be used for many, many different things. One thing that we do in this particular work is we apply it to study political polarization on Reddit. And so the question is, are people selecting into like-minded partisan communities on Reddit, and how is this changing over time? Okay, so I'm going to split the talk into two parts. Are there any questions about the setup or for what I mentioned, anything yet?
You're going to walk us through this neural embedding methodology?
Yes, exactly. That's the plan right now. Okay, sounds good. Let's do it. Okay, so first going to talk about our method for constructing social dimensions in community embeddings. First, I'm going to talk quickly about the data. So the data we use in the second part of the talk is Reddit. It's one of the world's largest social platforms. It's oriented around discussion. Discussion takes place in these little communities called subs. And we use the data set of 5 billion comments, actually a complete data set of comments from the inception of the commenting system in 2005 and up to and including 2019. Sorry, that's a typo. And that includes almost 35 million people. And we picked Reddit because it is a discussion-based, large social platform online. But crucially for us, Reddit has maintained a minimalist approach to algorithmic personalization throughout its history. So for most of it, actually, there was no algorithmic personalization at all. So when you wrote a comment in a subreddit, it was basically not attributable at all to any kind of algorithm personalizing what it thought you might like. It was because you sought out that subreddit and found it and engaged with it. There are like small parts of Reddit that are personalized now, but they still don't drive any significant, really, fraction of traffic. Okay, and so like I said, this is an embedding methodology that we use. Just some background. Word embeddings, if you haven't seen them before, very cool method that take in corpora of text, break them up into kind of sets of words and the context words that the first set of words appear in. And with this data, they kind of they construct a word embedding space where it's a high dimensional space where every word has a vector associated with it. And the cool part about it is that word embeddings encode semantic relationships. So the difference between the vector representations for man and woman is very similar to the difference between the vectors for king and queen. So you can solve analogies using this kind of semantic encoding. And so what we do is we build a community embedding with Reddit data. So the algorithm is kind of syntactically similar, but it's a very semantically different thing. So don't be confused by that. So what we do is we take subreddits as words and the people that comment in those subreddits as the context. So we're not looking at the text of comments at all. We're just looking at the metadata of who comments where. Okay, so we take in the 5 billion comments, but we don't really use the comments at all. All we use is the fact that commenters are commenting in certain communities. And so we do that on the top 10,000 communities, which is basically all of the activity over this actually 15-year period. And so what we get at the end of the day by running word2vec on this metadata data set is a community embedding where instead of having every word having a vector, so now every community, every subreddit has a vector such that two communities will be close in the space if they have very similar contexts. And so here contexts are people. So if two communities have very similar people being active in them, then they're going to be close in the space.
To interrupt your question here, Julian, do you want to answer your question?
Yes, I was wondering if the resulting the result is a bipartite network of memberships and people who are members.
Yeah, so that's what we're operating on is this bipartite graph between commenters and the people that comment in them. But the output is going to be in embedding space. So I can talk a bit more about that. Yeah, so thanks for the question.
Ashton, yeah. I have one too. So sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
So I think you said it's pseudonymous, right? I actually don't know Reddit all that well. It's pseudonymous, but is it reliably persistent identities? And you've got people changing their identities. What's the?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think yes. I'll answer that first by saying people generally stick with the same account on Reddit, but you can start several accounts. So one limitation of the method is that if you do start a new account for some reason, then we can't associate your first account with your second account.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, great. So if there's no further questions, I'll go on to the next slide. Okay. So here the similarity between two communities is just as in word embeddings, it's measured as the cosine similarity between their vectors. But what's really important is that our notion of community embeddings here is such that the similarity between communities is purely behavioral. So it just depends on the behavior of where you comment and not the content of what you say. And it's a socially constructed space. So two communities are similar if and only if a lot of people comment in them both. And so this has several pros. One is that we're not using content at all. We're not using annotators. We're not using surveys. So we're not subject to the same biases that previous approaches are. It's scalable to the entire platform and indeed to other platforms. This is a general purpose method that really only takes in the metadata of who is active where. And at least on Reddit, there's basically little to no algorithmic confounding, as I was mentioning. And one kind of theoretical way that we think about this is that it's an operationalization of kind of Zimmel's web of group affiliations. So, I mean, other people here, I'm sure, can kind of comment on Zimmel better than I can. But, you know, this kind of web of group affiliations that he was talking about was very fundamental in the understanding identity as it changed from the rural to the urban environment. So apparently, like in the rural environment, your social work and, you know, religious circles were largely overlapping and largely the same. But when people moved to the cities, they became like the unique intersections of these social circles that may be completely non-overlapping with their work circles and so on. And so to understand the person in the city, you know, you can understand this intersection of circles, and vice versa, you can understand the circles by the people that are in them. And so this method definitely takes that second part very seriously, which is we are understanding communities basically by the people that are in them and not the content of what they're saying. And crucially, we're understanding the differences and similarities between communities by the differences and similarities in the people that are active in them. So this space just works absurdly well. We have an online interactive that you can play with. Just to give you a sense, these are just, you know, a couple of examples, not cherry picked. You can go search your own communities if you're interested. But on Reddit, you know, the community associated with healthy food, for example, the very closest communities, the most similar communities in the original space are like nutrition, eat cheap and healthy, meal prep Sunday, fit meals, blah, blah, blah. All these communities are just like ridiculously related. And yeah, these are just behaviorally similar communities. So we're not looking at the text or anything. So it's interesting that, you know, obviously they seem like highly similar topics. One thing that's interesting is that self-improvement is on this list, although that's kind of self-improvement in general. So I think a text-based method wouldn't have ranked that as highly, and we see many examples of that. Another one is the Wire. You see a lot of the most similar communities being these kind of same genre TV shows. And then The Sims is a final one that I'll show. The Sims is a video game. It has a community that tilts towards the feminine end of the spectrum. And so the most similar communities here tend to be other communities in the kind of entertainment space that also tilt towards the feminine end of the spectrum. So even if it's a different thing, if it's not a video game, it might be a similar community because there's similar people in these two communities. Okay, and the super cool thing is that this semantic relationship property actually carries over into this community space. So the vector, for example, for Toronto, the difference between that and the community for Toronto Raptors is very similar to the difference between the community for Chicago and Chicago Bulls. So this relationship between city and the NBA sports team in that city is one of the millions of properties that was learned by this embedding. And so you get these semantic axes in these spaces that we're going to use to study the question that we started off with. So the method that we introduced in this work, community embeddings were existing before this. So what we did is we came up with this method for generating social dimensions. So we start with the community embedding, which has those behaviorally learned similarities between communities. We input a seed pair of communities that differ mainly in the target concept that we want to capture. And we take the difference between those two. Okay, so like this analogy thing that was on the previous slide, this is the same idea. So here we seed our partisan dimension with Democrats and conservative, which are two Reddit communities that differ mainly in partisanship, and they're very similar on many other axes, including the time at which they started on Reddit. Then we algorithmically augment this difference with other pairs of communities that have similar differences. So we go through, basically every other reasonable pair of communities, which is a lot because there's 10,000 communities, and we find things, for example, like Ask Hillary supporters and Ask Trump supporters, those are two other communities, the pair of which have a very similar difference to the initial pair that we put in. And you can see that these are very similar communities as well. These are both discussion-based, kind of Q&A-based communities that differ mainly in the target concept that we would like to capture.
Ashton, there's a question from Ron.
Yeah, go for it. Or is
Ron,
it
are you
written?
there?
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, we may have lost Ron. Let me just read it for you. So have you looked at how similarity varies if you look at participation? Example, ever posted as a proxy for reading a group?
Oh, yeah. So I think that is what we're doing. We're basically only using commenting, so participation in that sense. If Ron comes back, I can ask him exactly what he meant by that. But
yeah, okay,
that's essentially
we'll come
what we're
back
doing.
to that.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sure.
Yeah, so we come up with these, what we eventually used as the top kind of 10 seed pairs that were very similar to the input pair. And then we just average them out, and that becomes the resulting dimension that we're going to be studying. So we actually, so this averaging is actually similar to previous work. We tried many different methods, but it turns out just a simple average is the most robust thing. Okay, so I just want to show you, for example, so we put in the seed pair Democrats, Conservative, and then the other 9 pairs that we algorithmically found are here in the slide if you're interested in looking at them. But once we have this dimension, which is literally just a dimension in this vector space, any other community can be assigned a partisan score, which is just the projection of that community's vector onto this axis. And this actually turns out to be proportional to the average similarity of a community with the right seeds minus its average similarity of that community with the left seeds, if that's a better way for you to think about it. So essentially what we're saying here is that communities with user bases, with people that are more similar to the people in the left seeds, those are communities that are going to be more on the left-hand side of this axis, and vice versa is true too. So we're thinking of these dimensions as social dimensions because they're really proportional to the social differences between the people that are active in them. Okay. So once you have this method of assigning a score to every community,
Ashton?
yeah, sure.
Sorry, I am. David Madras had a question.
Yes, sure. Sorry, maybe I should open the chat. I didn't see it.
No,
but yeah,
no,
David,
right.
if you want to go ahead and ask it.
Yeah, I was just wondering what the benefit of adding these like 9 extra pairs to the seed was rather than just taking the direction.
Yeah, good question. I think you probably could do that too. What we wanted to do was sort of like regularize against any kind of idiosyncratic properties of the initial pair. So one thing that is tricky about this method is that once you get the dimensions, as I'll show you, it works very well. But to get the dimensions, you need these seed pairs that are different in the target concept and similar on everything else. And since communities are such like high dimensional things, it could be hard for that to be true of any individual seed pair. So what we found is that by kind of averaging over 10 different seed pairs, you can sort of cancel out all of these kind of random errors you might find in the initial seed pair.
Great, thanks. That makes sense.
No problem. Okay, cool. So now that we have this method of this dimension, we can project every community onto this dimension. So here we're projecting everything onto the partisan dimension that we found, and you get this kind of nice bell curve shape. We find that there really is this diverse distribution of community partisanship on Reddit, as you might expect if you ever have been on Reddit. And the communities that are all, tend to be on the left and right are exactly what you would expect. I'll show you a few more examples here. So the 10 most leftmost and rightmost communities are here shown on the left. And they really all do make sense. These are sort of what you would write down basically if you're like really in the Reddit world. The one that may not be clearest right away if you're not used to Reddit is the guns are cool being on the left wing side. A lot of Reddit communities have like kind of joking, ironic names. That is an ironic name. They do not think guns are cool. It's very anti-gun subreddit that tracks school shootings and stuff like that. Another way we validate this dimension at least at face value, is to look at the words. And this is something that we plan to do much more of, but you can basically, now that we have this community space, you can also project words onto this dimension as well and get a score for how left-wing and right-wing words are in their usage on Reddit. And these are also words that kind of line up with our intuitive understanding of partisanship on Reddit. Okay, so in this work, we're going to be looking at the dimensions according to US political partisanship, age, and gender. There are many, many others. I want to mention just that the methodology is very broad. So we have made dimensions for affluence, tenure, which is how long the communities have been active, social, how social a community is. So some communities are explicitly about finding other people, like, you know, for trading stuff offline and whatever. And some communities are very like antisocial. So that's a dimension that we find as well. And then there's a dimension for edginess, which is kind of like how me that community is. And there's many, many others. I think there would be even more others on different platforms as well. But we focus on these first three. Okay, and so here are the seeds if you want to see them. For the age axis, we used teenagers and Reddit for grownups as the seed pair, and you can see the other pairs that were automatically chosen. And for the gender axis, we used Ask Men and Ask Women, which are both Q&A communities where the respondents are expected to be, or at least asked to be, either men or women, depending on the community. One comment that I want to make clear is that we are studying social and cultural concepts as they are expressed on Reddit. So we're just studying Reddit data. We're making no claims that, for example, the people in these subreddits are like actually old or actually young. They're just behaviorally either kind of tilted towards the younger or older side of the axis for whatever reason. And also these social and cultural concepts, as we'll see later, actually differ on Reddit quite a bit sometimes from the offline understandings of these concepts. So for example, age on Reddit is, you know, the young side is maybe what you might think of as young, like teens. But the older side is like, you know, Ask Men Over 30 is one of the older communities. So basically on Reddit, over 30 is old. And so we're studying old and young terms. Everything that I'm saying here socially and culturally is related to Reddit. Okay, so we do a lot of work in validating these. I'll show you a few examples. So these are 4 plots, all of which is a different validation. I don't know if I'll talk about all of them, but for example, in the bottom left, we correlated the community gender score on the x-axis with the percentage of females in the occupation. So we are looking at the subset of communities that are dedicated to talking about an occupation. And it turns out that the correlation between these two things is very high. It's 0.89. There's, let's see. So the bottom 2 are external validations and the top 2 are internal ones. So bottom right is the kind of political correlation with the popular vote share for city-based communities. Top left is that the community scores for universities on Reddit are essentially all younger than the age scores for cities. So universities are younger than the cities that they're in. And finally, the top right is communities that are explicitly labeled left-wing are indeed scored as left-wing by our method. And communities that are explicitly labeled right-wing are indeed scored as right-wing by our method. So essentially every way we could try and validate these scores, they seem to work fairly well. And there's other validations in the paper if you want to see them. Okay, so I want to just kind of jump to some results now. This is, so first I want to just mention that we, in our initial embedding space, we just ran a very simple clustering algorithm on it to kind of separate communities into clusters of things. And just like, as a complete aside, it's like one of the best clusterings I've ever seen. It's just like, it's so amazing. Like the space works really, really well. So we clustered things into these 18 different top level clusters, which are sorted in decreasing order of size here on the y-axis. So every row in this plot is a different high-level cluster of communities. So for example, general interest communities, gaming communities, at the bottom, like cryptocurrency communities. These are the clusters that the high-level clustering found. And for each one of these clusters, I'm showing the distribution of partisan scores within that cluster. And this is just a percentile from 0 to 100. So for example, you can see that like gaming communities tend to be associated more with people who are active in right-wing communities, whereas things like hobbies and movies and TV and personal issues and LGBT, these are all more associated with the left wing. Politics, as you would expect, is highly bimodal. There's communities on the left, a ton of communities on the left, and there's a ton of communities on the right, not so much in the middle. And you can find a lot of different things to look at in this plot. I've also shown some outliers just so you can get a handle for what types of communities tend to be on the left and right. So like in USA, for example, theater was the most left-wing community, whereas Tag Pro was the most right-wing community. Maybe exposing my political leanings by saying I don't know what Tag Pro is. But for example, on personal issues, like librarians, sometimes these things aren't classified with 100% perfectly, but librarians is the most left-wing one there, and pro-life is the most right-wing one there. So a lot of these outliers can kind of illuminate a bit more what these dimensions are finding. And then, so just to show you the 3 different dimensions that we're looking at in this work, age as well and gender, kind of a lot of the communities, clusters of communities are organized along these cultural lines as you would think. So for example, hobbies I found was very interesting, that there tend to be very gendered. So it's a bimodal distribution on gender for whether hobbies are towards the masculine end or the feminine end. Anime is extremely young, and there's kind of endless fun things to talk about here. So I'll stop there and move on to some next results. But the
Ashton, can I ask you a question about what we know about the age distribution on Reddit as a whole?
Yeah.
Sort of this background.
That's a good question. I definitely know it tilts young. There's a good Pew study about that, so I forget exactly what the results are, but definitely the fact that old is like 30 and 40 on Reddit, I think does accord with what people have found is true. Yeah. Okay, so the next question I want to answer here with our method is, how do our notions of age, gender, and U.S. Political partisanship relate to each other on Reddit? So this is just a way of really kind of describing how these social and cultural concepts are similar and different at the same time from the offline versions of each of these concepts. So the way we're going to do this plot is slightly confusing, so I just want to walk people through it. We're going to ask the question for every, so the x-axis here is partisanship, and for every kind of quintile of partisan scores, I'm going to ask the question, what is the distribution of community gender scores within that slice? So the leftmost bar is going to be among the super left-wing communities, what is the distribution of community gender scores? And similarly for each different slice. So here's the results. So the purple is feminine and the kind of brownish color is masculine. And we see a really strong relationship. So these cultural axes are definitely not independent. Communities that skew left-wing also skew towards the feminine pole, and vice versa. And it turns out actually that, at the extremes, at the partisan extremes, communities on Reddit are almost completely segregated by gender. So there's no extremely masculine communities on the left wing, and there's no extremely feminine communities on the right wing. There are a couple of communities that kind of buck the main trend, but by and large, the Yeah, the masculine end is very much right wing, and vice versa. Okay, I'm going to show the same analysis now for understanding how partisanship and age relate to each other online. So same thing, a partisanship on the x-axis, and then within each quintile, going to show you the distribution of age. And here we see a strong relationship as well. It turns out that communities that skew left-wing also skew towards the older pole, and communities that skew right-wing skew towards the younger pole. And it's similarly segregated. But what's interesting about this is that this is actually, unlike the last analysis, this is the opposite of the offline analog, where typically, like for example, in the US electorate, the left usually skews younger, and the right skews older. But online, we see the complete opposite. And this is also kind of similar to other studies, especially post 2016, the right kind of became me and young. And so we're finding that in our analysis of Reddit as well. And you can see just some communities. So for example, some of the older left-wing communities are like skeptic, entertainment, and so on. And on the other side, you can see like younger right-wing communities are like 4chan, a lot of like meme stuff like that, just to show some examples. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the methodological part of the talk. So just to summarize, we introduce, based on community embeddings, a method of coming up with dimensions in these spaces that correspond well with online constructs that we would like to measure. So we're going to focus on partisanship, especially in this next section. And we find that online discussion really is kind of structured, organized along these cultural lines. And it's not always the same as it is offline. So online cultural things are not the same as offline, which is maybe not the most revolutionary statement ever, but that's our last result. Any questions before I talk about our application to political polarization?
There's a couple of comments in the chat, but I think I don't see any questions. Anybody want to hands up? Dan
Okay.
Brown.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, yeah, I'm really enjoying this. I'm just wondering about the placement of where the political views are on the axis in terms of, say, Democrats as left-leaning versus, say, socialism or anarchism or something like that, for example.
Yeah, great question. So we do find that our partisan axis, it's the axis that is kind of most dependent, for example, on the initial seed, and it is most variable. I think because partisanship is the most high dimensional concept of the three. I mean, that's an arguable statement, but that's what we found empirically. So we are definitely studying only US political partisanship, and even within the US, we're just studying Democrat and the conservative end of the spectrum. That was just a decision we made, but you could definitely study other ones. We have a follow-up paper actually specifically focused on politics and Reddit, where we come up with something like 8 or 9 different dimensions, some of which you mentioned. So like there's the anarchism dimension, and so on. So for sure, we're not kind of claiming this is just the one political axis, but we just chose this one in particular to study for this project, but it's not to say that there aren't others as well. Okay, so yeah, with that in mind, that's a great segue to saying that we're going to be studying US political partisan polarization on Reddit now. The background obviously is that political polarization, both ideological and affective, so both kind of what people believe and what they think of the other side, has been steadily increasing in the US and among many other places in the world. And the role of social media in this polarization and the echo chamber hypothesis in particular have been hotly debated. So some people and some research papers theorize and document kind of strong echo chamber effects, although one issue with that literature is that it's always static. So they always look at one kind of snapshot of social media usage over time, and social media usage, and they don't analyze it over time. But there's been also some other work that claim that echo chambers are overstated. So that, for example, echo chambers are much stronger, for example, in social media than they are if you take kind of a more holistic picture of someone's news consumption more generally, including kind of like cable TV and stuff like that. So we're going to remain focused on social media, and because we think there are a lot of gaps to fill in this literature. One is, first, do people select into like-minded partisan online discussion? That still is a question that hasn't fully been addressed, but definitely there's a big gap in, has this kind of discussion polarization changed over time? So essentially, we just are not aware of other analyses that take this kind of longitudinal look at it that we are. So looking at dynamics of polarization over time. And crucially also, because we have this longitudinal data set, we can also start to ask questions about, possible mechanisms behind polarization. So if polarization does change over time, is it driven by within user change is a big question. Like, do individual people polarize, or are kind of platform polarization effects driven more by the people, actual individuals kind of moving in and out of the platform, not them getting more extreme, just other people joining? So those are some of the questions that we're going to be addressing here. Okay, so first I just want to ask, how has partisan activity changed over time? So the nice thing about this kind of empirical style of studies, that once we've done the methodology, we can really just go ahead and count everything up and measure it. And so here is our first kind of big polarization plot. This is the distribution of partisan activity in political subreddits from 2012 to 2019, actually. Excuse me. Actually, no, this is 2018. That's right. Okay, so every bar here is a month, and every bar is the distribution of partisan activity in that month. And you can see that Reddit started off leaning left, but became kind of more mixed as it grew. So there's a really truly exponential growth underlying essentially this entire time period. So as Reddit became somewhat large in 2014, 2015, it's pretty mixed and fairly even. But then, of course, there is a really substantial increase in extremely partisan activity starting in 2016. So around the US presidential election 2016, we see this, really strong increase in, for example, in like the deep red that you see at the top of the distribution within each bar. That was much, much higher than it ever was before.
Ashton, can I just ask you a background? So Reddit is pre-20. Did Reddit just launch in 2012?
No, it launched, I believe, or I don't know exactly when it launched, but our data goes back to 2005, which is when comments started.
Okay, all right, because you said like started off. So I'm also just wondering, like, can you give us a sense of just overall size of Reddit from the beginning to the end?
Oh yeah, good. Let's see. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but I do know that during this time period I'm showing here, from 2012 to 2018, it grew exponentially. So there were, honestly, I don't have the raw numbers in front of me, so I shouldn't say anything. But essentially every year there's double the activity than there was the year before.
Right. So the point is, it's not a stable community that is. There's also a shift in big increase. There's whoever's joining, and so it's not exactly. It's not just organic to the community.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's something that people often forget, where I've seen this mistake happen before, where people will see potentially a change in platform level polarization, say, and then attribute it to individual level change. But it's not the same people, it's different people potentially. So yeah, so we'll definitely get into that later. The last comment I wanted to make just about these distributions over time. So this is just distribution of activity over time. The elevated levels of political polarization that we see in 2016, start in 2016, really persist for years afterwards. So it wasn't just this kind of, it did happen very quickly, but then it didn't go back down nearly as fast. Okay, good. Just two other views of the same data. So on the y-axis, I should just mention our measure of polarization is going to be the average absolute partisan score. So we have a partisan score that I showed you at the beginning, kind of varied from like -2 to +2. And the average absolute distance from the mean is a notion of polarization. So if activity is shifting towards the extremes, then it'll be the average comment will happen further from the mean. So higher we're thinking of as more polarized. And yeah, I mean, this average is really, it's strikingly stable for 2012 to 2016, and then it just absolutely rockets up to achieve a maximum in November of 2016, right around the election. And so the average absolute distance increased, as did the percentage of activity that took place in extremely partisan communities, which I believe we defined as either 2 or 3 standard deviations away from the mean. I believe it was 2. But yeah, you can see, especially on the right, almost no activity is in these extremely partisan communities before 2016, and then it's a really substantial amount. And on the left, it's a less extreme version of the same story. So in short, the platform really did become more polarized around 2016 and remained so afterwards. And so we're calling that really, it's like a significant kind of system level polarization event in 2016. But as Jillian's question leads us to think about, this, there's a question remaining here, which is this system level polarization that we observe, is it due to individual level change? Like, are people polarizing on Reddit? And that, could include the causal question of whether people polarize as a result of being on Reddit, but it also just includes, are people polarizing over time for any reason at all? So there's really 2 mechanisms that we have in mind here that we're trying to disambiguate. On the left, you can imagine the results that we just found being driven by individuals polarizing. So in this little schematic, you have people showing up over time, and when they tend to show up, they're tending to show up on the kind of milder end of whichever side of the spectrum they're on. But as they spend more time on Reddit, they become more and more polarized for one reason or another. That could be happening. Another thing that could be happening, though, is that there's between user polarization happening. So in my little schematic here, it could just be, everyone's actually no individual is polarizing, but the platform polarized because different people showed up at the extremes. So 2 very different mechanisms. I think it's important to understand which one is happening if we're going to be kind of deciding policy around social media and political polarization, as many people are talking about. Okay, so here is a decomposition of the previous results. So this is basically, you can think of polarization on the y-axis, that absolute, the average absolute z-score, so distance from the mean over time, but decomposed by user cohort. So, and the user cohort is decided by the date of your first political comment on Reddit. So if your first political comment on Reddit was in 2013, you're in the 2013 cohort. So there's many different things to see in this plot, and I'll walk you through it. The first, obviously, is that we see this major polarization event in 2016, during which every cohort that was on the platform did polarize. However, this intense increase in polarization in 2016 is really disproportionately driven by the 2016 cohort. So by new or newly political people in 2016, they are just way more polarized than any other cohort. And in fact, for years afterwards, they are still the most polarized people, despite that kind of never happening before or since. So in 2016, a really polarized group of people showed up. And just to put a number to it, system level polarization would have been 54% lower if the new users in 2016 were only as polarized as existing people in 2015, even though this group of new users only accounts for 38%. So a lot of this change that we observed in 2016, due to the new people showing up. Another thing is 2016 isn't the only year on this graph, even though it's the most striking. Individual level polarization is pretty rare. So besides the jump in 2016, most years, the existing users, existing cohorts are either stable or, even going down. So individual level polarization is not something we really see very often. But even more importantly to this question of whether there's individual level or between level polarization, individual level polarization seems to be unrelated to time spent on the platform. So we're not seeing this trend of like cohorts going up slowly over time or kind of being, polarization kind of depending on the cohort that you're in. Instead, the most important thing is just what calendar time it is. So we see polarization being synchronized with external events. So even within 2016, we see these two peaks, one that lines up with the primaries in the States and one that lines up with the election.
Ashton, can I ask you a question on this?
Yes.
So you have new subreddits emerging over time. So like you have the Trump and so on groups that are only emerging at these times. I'm kind of wondering how much, so how much of the effect is coming from the fact that we now have these maybe big new ones that are just designed to, that's the intention of them, is polarization. Like, come on over here, we're all the Trump supporters over here, or we're the Bernie supporters over there.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. To be clear, the like technology behind Reddit, it was always there to have these polarized communities, but they didn't really show up until later, as you mentioned. So I think that is a big part of the effect, but that is exactly the effect that we're trying to measure here, is to what extent is discussion taking place in echo chambers over time. And so that's exactly what we're trying to measure. Yeah. Any other questions?
Just Ashton, it's Peter Lowen here. This is it's kind of a follow on with Jillian's, but there must be some combination here of migration and then polarization within the platform once people have kind of peregrinated there, right? And that if you look at the American National Election Study, you look at other kind of survey measures of affective polarization, for example, it's obviously occurring before 2016. There is a break in the series at that point in time, but it's occurring all through 2000s and certainly after the election of Obama, right? So is there like, are you able to kind of give us some intuitions about why Reddit does Reddit become a uniquely attractive place to people because of its community structure for them to express this polarization, or is the same thing happening in other online communities?
Yeah, amazing questions. I wish I had the answers to them. So one thing maybe I should have made clear before, and I think you understand, but just to say it out loud, we're studying discussion polarization here. So just the extent to which discussion is occurring in homogenous communities, and the relationship of that with ideological or affective polarization is to some extent an open question. So I think you're right. There were these kind of like undercurrents of affective polarization kind of steadily increasing for years before this. But that's really not exactly the construct we're measuring. So it just so happens that, there's this huge change in discussion polarization. It's more kind of structural question that we're asking, but yeah, the connection with beliefs, for example, is not clear, but I wish it was. And then you also mentioned, how would this look on other platforms? Would love to study that. Haven't done it yet. I'm hoping to do that soon. But one nice thing is I think the method that we're proposing in this paper would be applicable to other platforms as well. Okay, so I'm going to continue here. So in a word, I think our point here is that the platform doesn't seem to have polarized people. Instead, people polarized the platform. So people showed up in 2016, and the party that you walked into in 2016 was just much more homogeneously organized along political affiliation than it was in any previous year. Another way to look at this that I think is pretty interesting is this is on the top, the average, polarization over time. And then in the bottom plot, which is really where the action is, we're breaking that down by what fraction is attributable to the new people that showed up that year and what fraction is attributable to the existing people. And really, most years, this is kind of flat. 2016, obviously the outlier here. And another way of just saying this is where the 54% figure comes from. 54% is attributable to the new people in 2016, even though they're a small part of the group.
Ashton,
yeah.
Avery has a question.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No worries.
Well, I was just wondering about botnets. I mean, since we're talking about polarization in a pseudonymous forum, how are you kind of reading this for the possibility of botnets that are specifically unleashed for election purposes, like in election years, which is what that last example was about? How are you kind of figuring that part?
Yeah, great question. So a couple of answers. We did do quite a bit of work trying to take out bots from our data. There was a bunch of different methods that we used for that. That was kind of one of the dirty little secrets of why this took so long, is like trying to take bots out.
Interesting.
Yeah. The other thing is whether this is true or not. Again, it's always hard to say because there's no real ground truth, but I think people have the sense that there's fewer bots and botnets on Reddit than there are, for example, on Twitter. So hopefully less of a problem on Reddit. There's definitely still bots on Reddit, but the kind of like coordinated kind of attacks, especially with comments, thought to be less of a thing. But yeah, again, that's really not a very back-upable statement. But yeah, we did put a lot of work into taking bots out. Just fun fact, one of the most related features was average response time. So there's a ton of bots that like just respond instantly to other comments. So if you're doing that, you're a bot and you're not in our data.
Really interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the percentage attributable to new and existing users. I'll just finish up with a couple other analyses. So we also measure within user polarization directly. So just how correlated are polarization scores for the same user over time. And this correlation is consistently high. It's usually over 0.8. You do see these two like epochs in Reddit's history in this heat map here around 2016. So people's scores are a little bit different before and after 2016 because, as we saw, everyone did polarize a bit. But within these two periods, these scores are usually pretty similar. And finally, we just also look at even more directly. We just look at what fraction of people change their polarization score by at least one standard deviation, excuse me, and it's usually very low, usually around 3 to 5% people. So we just don't really see a lot of evidence of individual people moving towards the extremes on our partisan axis, but we do see this large polarization event at the system level, which we attribute largely to between user polarization. So yeah, let me sum up there. It is, we're a little bit past the hour. So we introduced this methodology, which I think is broadly applicable. I would love to hear about the data sets that you have in your mind when you see this, this method. But we construct these social dimensions in embeddings, and we use them to measure macroscopic social, behavioral, and cultural phenomena on Reddit. And I think it's broadly applicable to online social media. We applied it to age, gender, and partisanship, and found that online cultural relationships don't always mirror their offline analogs. And as we've just been discussing, found the system level political polarization event on Reddit in 2016, during which it really kind of changed the fabric of Reddit forever. It's, every point after 2016 is more polarized than every point before 2016. But this was not really evidence of individual people polarizing, rather different people came to Reddit. So I just want to finish with some implications. It turns out that you can harness co-membership data. I'm a huge believer in this metadata approach to construct high-dimensional representations of communities and identifying kind of behavioral axes in these spaces. It's not to say that like the text is useless. Like our future projects now are very much trying to connect what people actually say with the signals that their behavior is telling us. But I do think that applying these kind of representations to metadata as opposed to data is really, really powerful. And one thing I didn't realize, actually, even being an avid Reddit user, is that these online cultural shifts can happen super quickly. This polarization event we saw in 2016 was a lot stronger than I thought, even knowing everything that happened in that year. But yeah, contrary to conventional wisdom, online polarization may be largely driven by between user changes rather than individual change. So with that, I will end here, and thank you for your attention and questions.
Great, thank you so much, Ashton. That was terrific. I'm going to go to Jennifer Nagel.
Hey, so thank you very much for that, Ashton. That was very interesting. I'm wondering about the extent to which you think the lessons that you're extracting from Reddit might generalize to algorithm-driven platforms where there are, efforts made to keep you within, or to even drive you towards increasingly polarized communities, if that's something that pays off in more platform engagement. Like, it seems to me, looking at your data, there's a sense in which, oh wow, it looks like Reddit is almost like depolarizing people a bit, that they start out joining perhaps for reasons of homophily, right. And then it seems like maybe they diversify their communities. They get into the city group as well as the political group that they join for over time.
Right.
But it might be that for platforms that are driven by algorithms that are increasing engagement, there could be a tendency to sort of feed on homophily rather than diminish it over time. And I'm just curious, like, what your gut sense is about whether the lessons you're getting here are going to carry over to Facebook and platforms like that.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think in the second part of the talk, like the results that we find from these platforms like Reddit that are driven mostly by user choice, those lessons may not necessarily translate over to the algorithmic platforms, but the method does. And actually, we have applied this method to Spotify data. So I did this research project. I can basically give a whole other SRI talk on that one, but used actually basically the same method to study exactly that. What are the algorithmic effects on the diversity of your consumption on Spotify? And we found some cool stuff. So first of all, engaging diversely is a good thing, both for the user and the platform. So it turns out that people are way more likely to convert to the premium product. They're more likely to stay on the platform if they're more diverse users, given the activity level that they're at. So take two people, listen to 100 songs a month. One is more diverse than the other. The diverse user is way more likely to stay on the platform. So diversity is good in that sense. But the interesting part of that study was that we found that engagement with the algorithm recommendations was strongly correlated with narrow consumption. So as you're saying, like the kind of homophily kind of driven algorithms definitely restrict people and make you less diverse over time. So I think there's this genuine trade-off in algorithmic platforms where there's short-term engagement for sure from listening to music through recommendations or whatever, but there's these long-term trade-offs for, I'm becoming less and less diverse over long periods of time.
That is so cool. And it suggests maybe some tweaks to the sort of explore-exploit ratio that these platforms are using, right? Because I feel like Spotify gives me a lot more of the same, and it's always fun when they think outside the box with me. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's cool. Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Thanks very much. Travis.
Hi, thanks for a super interesting talk. I just wanted to ask about a couple of maybe variables concerning the data set. I'm sure you've considered a bunch of these as a Reddit user, but I wonder if you could maybe speak a bit more to them. So the contexts you said at the start are sorry, did you say it was commenters or comments?
We use both. So did you mean in constructing the embedding?
Oh, that was just a clarificatory question to remind myself about, what you were using to construct the embedding, whether it was users, like commenters,
users.
or whether it was the comments.
Yeah, users, okay. Exactly.
So, right, then in that case, there's a few things that sort of struck me when you were presenting your results, which, I'm sure the wide kind of robustness of these results serves as a really nice sanity check that it's doing something right. But I wonder if you could speak to some potential confounders. So, for example, right, subreddits are not just free-for-alls, they're moderated. And so, sometimes comments are deleted by moderators, things like this. Right. And that might affect, if somebody who is more liberal is trying to comment in one of these more right-wing, right, you might have. So is it the users or is it the moderators that's really driving this polarization, right? Yeah. That might be a question as well. There's, I mean, I don't know what the statistics are on this, but I assume that there's probably a small group of people that post frequently and a large group of people that post infrequently. And so this sort of like loud minority, right, is that maybe driving some of these results in some of these cases. And I mean, I have some other thoughts, but maybe I'll just leave it at that. And
yeah, no, great questions. Yeah, I think both of the confounds that you mentioned are present. So definitely, if you're banned from a subreddit, then you can't comment in it. And even if you wanted to comment in it, you can't. And so as a result, that subreddit will be ever so slightly further away from other ones that you take part in. And if that happens in a kind of structured way, which it certainly does, then that will affect our space. So that's definitely true. So our, I guess the way to think about it is that our space is socially constructed, not just by the users who are trying to comment, but by the moderators who police those comments. So that is definitely true. There's a lot of interesting work on moderation practices in Reddit. They're as problematic as that would sound like. So yeah, for sure, that's a confound. And I mean, I don't know if it's a confound as much as it is sort of just an input. So, there's just, these spaces are just the aggregation of lots of different decisions by many people, and that's an important group to keep in mind. I think is the way I would think about that. And yeah, the latter one is true too. There's a big heavy-tailed distribution in activity. There's some people that comment a lot, some people that comment fewer. One thing we did find is that you can construct this embedding by downweighting the importance of active people and upweighting the importance of inactive people, and at least qualitatively, it didn't really seem to change much. So that's definitely a big input into word embeddings, because you want rare words to have just as good positions as the common words. So it's an easy thing to tweak. But yeah, we didn't find a huge difference there. So I don't really think that's a potential problem, but it's definitely something that, changes the space a bit.
Great, thanks very much. Nico.
Hey, Ashton. So great presentation. I saw in one of the fine prints of your slides a mention to this book by Cass Sunstein and hashtag Republic, which I really liked. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions that relate that book perhaps to what you have done, or perhaps to what can be done with this data, with these approaches. So in his book, Sunstein talks about polarization, and he proposes two solutions or two ways to reduce polarization. One is to increase random encounters among people, and the other is similar in a sense, having more opportunities for common experiences across different people. So I was wondering whether in the kind of analysis that you do, there is a way to sort of identify events, shocks, or something that makes it more likely for different communities to interact with each other and maybe track how over time their level of polarization, at least for a while, goes down. So is there any work on this? Is there any way to conjectures, way to do it, and stuff like that?
Yeah, awesome question. I don't think there's anything that does exactly what you did, but I'm going to write it down, so maybe we can do that.
That'd be great.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, no, that's a great idea. I can just say a couple of things that come to mind. There's work I've done on, unfortunately, sort of the opposite of. There's a practice in Reddit of people like brigading other subreddits. This definitely happens in political communities where, people from one community will like all en masse decide to go into the other community and like spew hatred and stuff. So that definitely happens.
Some sabotage.
Yeah, sabotage.
okay.
Yeah, for sure. So there's been a paper specifically about that, and actually uses this community embedding idea as well. That's another kind of potential like confound here, which is that we're treating every comment the same, although certainly not every comment is the same. Kind of similarly in citation analysis, how most citations are positive, but some are negative. So yeah, you have this work trying to isolate those two things. But yeah, no, I love that question. Like one other thing I can mention is that you can all this analysis that we're doing at the community level here, but you can also do it at the individual level, which is really like, yeah, which communities are you taking part in? And I think it would maybe be easier to do that question on the individual level, but certainly the community level is interesting as well. Yeah, but I love the idea. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Super. Thanks, Jack.
Hi. Thanks for your talk. I have a question. I'm worried it might just be a nitpick about the way you were discussing your results, but I haven't fully grokked your results, so it might be my fault. When you were discussing the relationship between your polarization axis and your gender axis, you said that you see this segregation by gender, and I think it is a risk of slipping in the way you think about, and the way I think about your results, and perhaps also you, between polarization defined in the million ways you can define it, and your specific data about how these subreddits work in this particular online community. So in the case of the segregated by gender, if I think about a gendered subreddit that's gendered male, I think about a bunch of things that, because of the current formations of the culture wars and where feminism lies in those structures, are going to be associated with the right wing, and vice versa for female, maybe to a lesser extent. So I would expect to see that polarization that you found, that kind of polarization, but it's not like it's not male female users, and it's not even, obviously, and it's not even interested in male and female users. It's like signaling genderedness along a particular like already structured formation of cultural like tropes of how we think of gender and the expression of genderedness. So like but so I don't think you obviously didn't mean that it was literally segregated by gender when you said that, because we've politically we know that women vote conservative sometimes and stuff, but yeah,
that's right. So I can maybe rephrase that, right? So what I meant by that is just that the for example, the extreme, like I was showing, the extremely left-wing communities are essentially, none of them are all tilt towards the masculine side, and vice versa is true as well. But it's not to say that these kind of definitely not true of like individual traits, but just kind of like aggregate patterns of the community. So for sure, there's lots of examples even within those communities of like countervailing topics being discussed, but it's not sort of true at the kind of average level. Is that?
I mean, there must be subreddits for like left-wing dudes deconstructing toxic masculinity, or people involved in stuff like the White Ribbon campaign and stuff like that. I mean, they might be small. I'd be curious to see like if you could pick out some of those and see how they fit into the rest of your analysis of polarization. That might be interesting, but.
So there are some of those communities, but there literally are none at the extremes that I was talking about. So there's still a bunch of communities that like lean left wing and like lean masculine. But the sort of extreme that I mentioned truly is empty. So yeah, it is. It is kind of an extreme result in that sense. Yeah, but certainly there are some communities that are like, yeah, bucking the trend, like you're pointing out, but not as many as you might think. I think. Yeah.
Thanks.
Great, thanks. Travis has some additional questions in the chat, but I'm going to hold on for a minute, Travis, because I want to get one of mine in.
Sure.
So if I recall correctly, GPT-2 was constructed primarily on Reddit.
Yeah.
So just thinking about, the community is just a terrific talk, and I'm really excited about this community embeddings technique, and excited to see that in other places. So I guess I sort of think, okay, so this tells us something that we sort of worry about, which is that we're training language models on stuff that's on the internet, and that's easily cheaply accumulated into massive data sets for building that. I wonder if there'd be a way of thinking about, using that embedding technique or the polarization methods, if we thought that that's a bad thing to be kind of now embedding in our language models. Is there some way we could use this kind of as a technique to say, look, don't build your language model on these super polarized communities or groups, I guess subreddits or whatever. Anyway, just curious, as I was really struck by
yeah, definitely
going up there.
That's on kind of ongoing work now, is somewhat similar to that, which is like understanding the linguistic differences between the different sides of our spectra. So what would, at least on Reddit, how different would the GPT-2 be if you trained it only on the left wing versus only on the right wing? Questions like that are definitely possible with this method. So yeah, I think just generally speaking, augmenting a lot of the textual work that's being done on these social media sites, I think can be augmented with the sort of metadata driven social measures that we're putting forth here.
Great. And one other question for me, I'm just, can we so I know you're not looking at the content of comments here, and that's sort of future work, and I think that's really interesting, because I want to think about the norm enforcement that goes on to maintain that group. Travis's point about explicit moderation, but then to what extent do these groups basically shout down anybody very quickly? Do they have different behaviors in there? But I'm thinking about exit and voice, and I'm thinking, so how much of this, how much are people just leaving? Like, you go in, you want to just be in a conversation about healthy baking, and for some reason it's become flooded with polarized comments. I'm not sure how much you're seeing that, but how much is do you think, like, the polarization of the community? I know, I know since you're using this embedding technique, you're trying to get at the community makeup apart from this particular subreddit that's evolved. Anyway, just curious about the movement, I guess, out of communities. Yeah.
So are you asking about how people move between communities, or the communities themselves changing?
Well, I'm just trying to think about how much of, you sort of emphasize it's actually platform. I mean, it's platform polarization. We've got these groups that are highly polarized. I'm wondering how much membership in the groups is affecting the polarization. Like, do people just, leave because they're saying, look, I just can't, I wanted to participate in this conversation about Trump, right, without being crazy. But they just can't, they just leave. So
I think that's a huge part of it. For sure. And it's just the community membership really is, in a sense, like kind of what we're measuring. The plots that I showed are measuring activity in these subreddits, but if you count talking those subreddits as membership, then we are measuring that. One thing that I'll mention, though, that I think is kind of that will tie in with your comments and others here as well, is that another limitation of this method, at least the way that we're currently doing it, is we're treating a subreddit as constant over time. So we're learning one embedding for all time. And I think that's generally fair, because usually subreddits are around about a particular topic that doesn't change so dramatically. But that's not always true. So there's some communities that themselves polarize, but we're not tracking that because we consider a community's score as being fixed over time. And so all of our results are due to these changes in dropping out and memberships changing, as you're talking about. But a problem with that is that we're not tracking how the conversation within a subreddit could be changing. Or we are, it's just that we're taking the average. So I think, in future work, what we would like to do is make dynamic versions of these embeddings and tracking how communities themselves change over time.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. So I'll come back to Travis. Travis, do you want to, I saw you had a couple of comments in the follow-up questions there.
Yeah, I'll mostly just leave those comments in the chat box. You can look at them later if you please. But I guess I will say one thing that is sort of a follow-up to Jillian's question and your most recent responses, that if the community embeddings are based on commenting, but the sort of currency of the realm for Reddit is upvotes, right?
Yeah.
And so I wonder if some of the stability is not from the fact that, right, you might get comments from sort of both sides. And so it seems like you have really not a lot of polarization, but if you looked closer, you'd see actually some is getting upvoted. I wonder if you've looked at the upvoting structures within the communities and whether or not you see polarization within those structures, or if that's possible with the methods that you have here.
I would love it. It's possible with the methods, but it's just not possible with the publicly available data, which is don't know who voted on what. So you could definitely do the same thing on the upvoting data. So yeah, you could understand. Yeah, I think that would be fascinating. So certainly anecdotally, I think that's true too, where you have like factions of people upvoting a comment and other factions of people downvoting the same comment. There's just sort of fights within communities. Yeah, would love to study that. Don't have the data for it. And another thing that brings to mind is that we don't have consumption data. So this is all on production data. So like who comments where, who actually writes something down, and communities are similar if you write things into communities. I mean, I think that's good for some things and good for what we're studying, but I think, obviously consumption is much more prevalent than production. So I'd love to do the same data on who visits which pages without necessarily writing something down. Yeah, so kind of similar thought there.
Great. And for our last question, we've got Ron Bodkin back with audio, so I'll go to him.
Oh yeah, right, good.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think actually you just literally addressed my question about, how do you look at not just people who are posting, but participating in some way. I'm curious, on the other side, you studied people arriving in the polarization. Did you study what the polarization of people who are leaving the platform looked like? Like, is it driving less polarized people out?
Yeah, great question. So actually, that is literally something we've been doing this week, this looking at the people who churned off the platform and how polarized they were. So I can probably answer that question tomorrow or whatever, if you want. I can send you an email about it. But yeah, definitely interested in seeing the churn, and would love to incorporate other signals. So if someone has an in with Reddit and has consumption data lying around, just feel free to ship it over to me.
Great. Okay. Well, thank Ashton. That was really just terrific, and I'm so glad you presented that work to us. It's just right in our sweet spot. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you all.
Next week, we have Frank Riddich, who's presenting on the allegory of the OR, ethics and aesthetics and cybernetics. So we will look forward to seeing you all next week, and have a great weekend. Thanks.